I think a lot of these guys have it backwards where if they believe that volume is the most important thing, if you believe that volume is the most important thing, then you're going to reduce intensity in order to get more volume.
Mm-hmm.
But if you believe that higher effort training and progressive overload is primary, then volume and frequency become subservient to that.
Wits and Weights community, welcome to another episode of the Wits and Weights podcast. Joining me again is the super knowledgeable Andy Baker. Last time he was on episode 60, we talked about his approach to programming, strength training for older adults, his philosophy on coaching, and methods in the world of lifting. Andy is a highly sought-after strength coach, the author of Practical Programming and the Barbell Prescription, host of the Baker Barbell Podcast, which just came out with some fresh episodes, and the owner of Kingwood Strength and Conditioning in Texas. We thought it would be fun today to talk about bodybuilding, not the big B competitive physique sport, but the little b method of hypertrophy-oriented bodybuilding style training for aesthetic muscle development to improve your physique. Andy knows a lot about bodybuilding and training for muscle mass from years of real-world experience coaching people in person and online. And in fact, one of his 3 programming tracks in his online Baker Barbell Club, which I'm a member of, is a bodybuilding track. And I'm personally running that for the final 3 months of my own building phase and plan to continue into a fat loss phase next year. We're going to talk about bro splits, the top set, back off set approach, intensity versus frequency, maybe the interplay between hypertrophy and strength, and some of the techniques and philosophy behind this training style. Andy, it's great to have you back on again.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
So let's just jump right in and talk about your personal experience with bodybuilding as a primary style of training. Because a lot of us know your history with strength and conditioning. We know starting strength, a little bit of the CrossFit world. And then there's this idea, of course, that hypertrophy is sometimes a dirty word in some of those circles. And, inquiring minds want to know how and why do you incorporate this training style for yourself?
Well, it's what I started with. I mean, if you go way back in the day from the first time that I picked up weights when I was, 12, 13 years old, that was that. I mean, at the time, if you go back through the history kind of this stuff, at that time in the 90s, that was the only information that was really available. There wasn't the internet as we know it today. And so there was no social media, which I know is hard for a lot of maybe our younger listeners to understand, but there wasn't the only sources really out there. The primary sources in which people got information at that time was through the muscle mags. It was through publications like Flex Magazine and Muscular Development. Iron Man maybe had one powerlifting article, our Bill Starr article, but it was a bodybuilding mag. Everything, all of the information that we had was bodybuilding. You had publications like maybe Powerlifting USA or whatever, but it was obscure and it wasn't on, you could go to any newsstand, any magazine rack in the country and find Flex Magazine and Muscular Development. But Powerlifting USA was very hit or miss. For the most part, you just had to be subscribed to it through the mail. And that was it. That was really the only sources of information. So when you got into lifting, it was just done bodybuilding style. I mean, pretty much everybody did, unless you were maybe in the sports world. But recreationally, it was all bodybuilding. And then, if you look at participation in sports like powerlifting, with the time when I was growing up, early 90s or 90s and, early 2000s, powerlifting wasn't what it is today. In that, one, there was no social media and there was just not wide participation in the sport of powerlifting. It was a very, very niche community. It was a very small sport. And the other thing, the biggest thing is it was all done in gear. It was all done in multiply lifting suits. That's all powerlifting was done that way. If you went to a meet in the 90s, there was no raw powerlifting. There was single ply and multiply, but everybody competed in gear. And if you showed up to a meet and competed raw, they'd be like, what the hell are you doing? It'd have been like showing up to a track meet in dress shoes or something. That's the way it was done. So there wasn't a lot of interest in that style. It was a much smaller niche sport because of that. And when things kind of converted over to raw powerlifting, which I attribute mainly to the influence of CrossFit into the strength world, it brought more awareness to the barbell lifts than probably anything else. And by extension into raw powerlifting. Now that's flipped where if you go to a meet, there's very little geared lifting. There's very little multiply lifting. It's all raw. And because of that, there's much more participation in the sport. I just think it's naturally more interesting to people to, see what a guy can do in a singlet and maybe some knee sleeves versus multiply suits. So that being said, my point with all that is that my formative years as a teenager and early 20s, really the only information out there, unless you just happen to stumble into a powerlifting gym, was bodybuilding stuff. So that's how everybody trained. Of course, all kids, all teenagers, when you're 12, 13, 15, 17, I mean, everybody, there's something about the comic book level physique development that's appealing. It just is. It's a representation. It's an art of, what is possible of potential, if you want to talk about it artistically, of potential, something like that. And there's a draw to it, I think, that every young person goes through, and everybody trains that way. I happen to respond pretty well to that type of training. When I was a teenager and in my early 20s, I found it, I was highly responsive to that type of training. I found it fairly easy to get big. I actually a lot of people don't know this, but I had an amateur, I'm probably the only starting strength coach around that's actually been featured in Flex magazine. So when I was 19 years old, so I still have I think the October issue of 1999 or 2000, something like that. So I put on muscle pretty easily, and that was that was without the use of drugs or anything like that. So I think when you have some success with something, you tend to gravitate to and do more of it, study it more, put it into practice more. So there was just always kind of a fascination with that. I think what happens though is as you get older, the fascination with becoming, superfluously enormous starts to dwindle, and you start to see a little bit more value or just get more interested in the performance side of things. And so that's where you start, a lot of guys follow that natural progression of starting with a lot of interest in the physique side of things. And then there's a period of time where, you do want to start, you start becoming more interested in what you can do, not just necessarily what you look like, especially when you realize that there's a cap on how big you can actually get naturally. Whereas theoretically with strength, there's still a cap, but a lot of times there's a lot of potential left to be developed. And so I kind of gravitated, at some point in my early 20s away from the physique development stuff and into more of the powerlifting side of things, to which I, met Mark Ripito and became more educated in actually the performance side of things. It's been a good decade or more doing that. I still do a lot of that, but being more involved in powerlifting than bodybuilding. But now as I've gotten older again, you just kind of a natural swing back to just, part of it is just the interest of the customer base. Potentially there's more, again, the pendulum kind of swung away from bodybuilding into powerlifting, CrossFit, all that kind of stuff during the 2000s. And now you're starting to see the pendulum start to swing back into the physique stuff. And I feel like now in my 40s, I actually have more to offer maybe my clients than I did in my early 20s. I feel like now I have a better understanding as a coach. I have a better understanding of how to put this stuff into practice in a sensible, dare I say, more scientific way that, than I would have in my early 20s when I kind of knew what to do, but I couldn't have articulated very well why I was doing what I was doing or why it worked. I kind of knew what to do, but I wouldn't have had the ability to explain it or put it into practice with more people like I do now.
Yeah, I think a lot of us gravitate to your work because of that. You're able to articulate it. We were talking before we recorded about how just with all that experience in the gym, talking with people, doing this stuff, it comes together. That goal of getting superficially enormous, a lot of us probably still want to get there as a goal. But you mentioned a few things. First of all, the history of all this is fascinating, how even the things we dump on like CrossFit had a critical part to play, right? In introducing barbells to folks. It introduced me to barbells. And then I came to starting strength, and I never had the bodybuilding stuff, or if I ever did, like a lot of us, we were just doing it wrong or, doing it ineffectively.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting how it comes together, and you have this kind of open-minded approach to, incorporating all these styles, which is why I wanted to focus more on bodybuilding today, instead of just the strength side. But you did mention strength and hypertrophy, and there's always this confusion about how do these interplay? What is the overlap? I know sometimes you might get a little annoyed when somebody's like, well, I want to focus on this, not strength. You're like, yeah, but it's all strength, right? Like there's strength everywhere. You mentioned on, I think, 2 podcast episodes ago on Baker Barbell Podcast, 3 factors. You said muscle mass, motor recruitment, and intermuscular efficiency, implying that there's this overlap between them all and they contribute to each other. Can you just summarize that here? I mean, people can listen to the whole detailed episode, but just kind of summarize that.
So that was when you look at strength. I mean, strength is force production, right? It's the ability to displace a load or to however you want to define it, but strength is force production. And it's you cannot divorce strength from load. The person who squats 500 is stronger than the person who squats 400. So what are the elements that affect your ability to move greater and greater loads? What are the elements in place that are going to make you go from a 300-pound squat to a 400-pound squat to a 500-pound squat? And really there's three. We're going to skip over things like mindset and consistency and determinate, like, yes, those are important, but they're not. We're going to just focus on the more physical side of things. The primary way in which somebody is able to, well, it's hard to say what's primary and what's secondary and all that, because I think it changes with the development of the athlete. But by and large, the most important determining factor as to how much weight you're going to be able to move on a given lift, let's just say for a 1-rep max, is the amount of muscle mass that you carry. I mean, in powerlifting, 9 times out of 10, the guy with more muscle mass is going to win. It's just, you don't see people that walk into the gym or to a meet. You see some enormous, big, jacked guy with his, traps are coming out of his ears and a big wide back and huge shoulders and big legs. He's going to be stronger 9 times out of 10 than the guy that doesn't look like that. So muscle mass matters. And I think for years, we always assumed it was just the heavier athlete would win. I mean, that was the saying, mass moves mass. I mean, and in general, the heavier weight classes outperform the lower weight classes in terms of absolute load. Maybe not based on a percentage of body weight or whatever, but in general, the heavier, the 308s and the 275s are going to move more weight than the 220s and the 198s. That's just the way that it is. Now, is that just weight, or is that because of the fact that the heavier guys have more muscle? And I think what modern powerlifting has shown us is actually, it's not just the mass moves mass or whatever. It's just that when you're 308 pounds, you have the potential to carry a lot more muscle than the guy that's 198 pounds. But what we're seeing now is that if you look at the physiques and the body fat level of modern day raw powerlifting, they're far leaner, I think, and more muscular than what you saw maybe 20 years ago, with some exceptions. There's always been big jack guys, to Kurt Kowalskis and all that kind of stuff. But there's a realization it's not just about how heavy you are, but how much muscle you carry. I mean, you look, the best lifter in the world right now is John Hack, in my opinion. And the guy is absolutely loaded with muscle mass, but he carries very little body fat, almost. Was that a race to the bottom with hitting the lower weight classes that led to that, or is there an advantage of actually carrying the lower body fat? Well, I think that there is. I think more and more research has shown that excessive amounts of body fat can be detrimental to the ability to build new muscle mass. I mean, things like, if you're obese, things like testosterone and things like that tend to suffer. Insulin sensitivity is poor, all those sorts of things. And I think, higher testosterone levels, better insulin sensitivity, those are all things that are good for being able to build muscle mass, just being healthier overall. But it is harder. Most people know, just if they have any experience with this stuff, if you're trying to bulk without putting on any body fat, or really trying to minimize the amount of body fat, this as a nutrition guy. If you're trying to gain muscle mass and you say, well, I want to gain muscle, but I don't want to put on any fat, it's almost an impossible task. Or it'll take you 7 years. Yeah. It'll take you forever. But if you want to, if you're wanting to move up in weight class or just get bigger, there has to be an acceptable level of body fat increase most of the time. There's a few cases, I think, of just genetic outliers that, most IFBB pros would fit under this category, where they are able to put on tons of fat-free mass. But that's not most of us. If you're going to want to put on 20 pounds of muscle mass and you don't want to take 20 years to do it, you're going to put on a little bit of body fat, in order to do so. I think, and if you don't care about that at all, if you're willing to put on even more body fat, you can potentially gain muscle even faster. It kind of just depends. I don't think that it's a good idea to, and I think recent experience has taught most of us this, is that, just the seafood diet of, I'm just going to pound as many calories as possible and, fast food and pizza, and just, you are going to put on more muscle mass if you're in a massive caloric surplus like that. But even in a massive caloric surplus, you could still only put on muscle mass so fast. And so you're still going to be accumulating, more body fat than is necessary. So there's you could probably speak to this better than I can. There's a balance there, right? There's a cutoff point where if you're not willing to put on any body fat whatsoever, you're going to struggle to build muscle mass. If you're doing the seafood diet where you just eat everything in sight, yes, you're going to put on muscle mass, but probably at the expense of putting on more body fat than you really want. So
yeah, that was my big turning point after starting strength, of like needing to learn about nutrition. And the folks in your barbell club, that's usually when they come to me. It's like, okay, I got a little bit too much crazy on the dreamer bulk. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't know where I was going with that originally. But,
we were talking about the strength versus hypertrophy and the factors.
Yes.
You were talking about muscle mass.
So muscle mass. So yeah. Okay. I know where I was going now. So item number one is, if you want to dramatically increase the amount of weight you can move, you probably need to get bigger. You need to add more muscle mass. That's going to be the primary determining factor. It's also the most long-term solution to getting stronger, because the other two that I'm going to talk about are a little bit more transient adaptations. You're talking about more the efficiency of a system, which comes and goes. The building of muscle mass, but also the loss of muscle mass, is a slower process than the development and or loss of neurological efficiency. Neurological efficiency can be enhanced in a pretty short period of time. It can also be lost in a pretty short period of time. And when we talk about neurological efficiency, I kind of look at it in two different ways. One would be what we call I always get these two confused, but the intramuscular coordination, or what we would call motor unit recruitment. So if we look at an individual muscle, like the quads or whatever, on a squat, and their role in the squat, training your ability over time for your body to recruit more of the muscle mass that it already possesses. Okay. So for an untrained lifter, and I don't know what these percentages are, but let's say for an untrained lifter, they're capable of, this is a very, very simplified, an exercise phys guy would rip me apart for my explanation of this, but I'm going to keep it very, very simple.
I do it all the time. It's all right.
Well, I think the simplistic version still works as a way to understand this. So even if some of the nuanced details are wrong or whatever, it still works. But let's just say a new lifter that is, has never been exposed to heavy weight or whatever. Let me say his quads are capable of motor unit recruitment at 30%. In other words, he's capable of recruiting 30-40% of the muscle mass that he has. With training, the more that he trains, and in particular, the more heavy training that he does, say with reps 5 and below, so the very heavy training especially, that becomes a trainable quality in that his body will learn to recruit more of the muscle mass that he currently possesses, say in his quads from heavy squatting or whatever. So now, instead of recruiting 30% of the available muscle mass that he has, he's recruiting 40%, then 50, and then 60, and then 70%. So that's a trainable quality. So that's increasing his ability to produce force without getting bigger. So in kind of the muscle mass, you're recruiting the amount of muscle that you have. And then with motor unit recruitment, you're recruiting more of what you have. So you can increase
untapped. Yeah. It's like untapped capacity that you're finally tapping into.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you have the third element of it, which is the intermuscular coordination, which is the coordination between muscle groups. So this is why training leg extensions, leg curls, the adductor machine, the glute machine, sit-ups and back raises, while doing all of those things individually, don't necessarily lead to as big of a squat as does squatting. Because it's not just each of those, yes, all those individual muscles play a role in the squat, but they have to be trained to work together in order to optimize the efficiency. So you could have a guy theoretically that could increase muscle mass in his lower body through a series of isolation movements. He could leg curl, leg extension, adductor machine, a glute, whatever those call it, hip thrust or whatever. Mm-hmm. And, he could train all of the constituent muscle masses used in a squat individually, would not have the same impact as just training the squat, because not only is he working those muscles, but he's working them together. And so that they become better at working in a coordinated fashion in order to do that movement. If you look at, and again, this is a trainable quality, the more squatting that you do, theoretically, and there's an upper limit for sure, but the more squatting that you do, the more volume and frequency or whatever that you do, potentially the better you get at it. Movements that are highly demanding in terms of coordination and timing and that sort of thing need to be practiced more often. This is why Olympic weightlifters tend to clean and jerk and snatch daily. Why do they do that? Because why are they doing that? Why don't they just clean and jerk twice a week or snatch, because that's not enough to really fine tune that coordinate, because those are very complex movement patterns that require it's practice. I think practice could be looked at in two different ways. There's practice in you intellectually understanding what you need to do. So that's me teaching you how to do a clean and jerk. Like, okay, you don't know that you need to, brush your thighs with the barbell and then jump at a certain, you're intellectually learning how to do that. And then you're practicing that. But there's a deeper level of, quote, practice at the neurological level. It's your nervous system learning how to do that. It's why professional baseball players take batting practice every day, even during the season. That's why because at that level, when those guys develop their swing, it is so nuanced and so individualized and so timing oriented and coordinated. It needs to be practiced almost daily in order for those pathways to be maintained. Where, I think a squat, you could argue that's a little less technical, but there's also some physiological realities in that there's muscle damage created in a squat that's maybe not as present, say, on a snatch or a baseball swing. So those are three elements that if you want to maximize strength, those three things need to be addressed. Now, what needs to be prioritized kind of depends on the lifter. A guy that's been squatting for 20 years may not need that much, quote, practice. Like that movement is kind of ingrained in his body to where he doesn't need, but a newer lifter, that's part of why they maybe benefit from squatting 3 days per week, because that movement pattern is not yet embedded in their neurological system. It's like, to a degree, it's like riding a bike, right? I mean, if you've spent a lot of time as a kid riding a bike, you can take 10 years and off, and, that's the saying. It's just like riding a bike. You jump back on and maybe you're a little wobbly at first, but, within an hour, you're back to being able to ride a bike and not feel like you're going to fall off. So,
yeah. Oh, and I know you see it all the time with the new lifters doing the squat. They're wobbling, they're unstable, and some people are more athletic than others that kind of have that precision ability to do it, and some are just solo. But it doesn't take long to get at least that first step jump, I think, in these elements.
Yeah, and you definitely see it in the effective programming that is used for powerlifters at different levels. Guys that tend to focus, if you look at the training programming for especially modern day, the guys that tend to benefit the most from very high volume, high frequency programming. So these are the guys that are benching 4 days a week. I've seen some guys that bench 5 or 6 days a week, but guys that bench 4 days a week, maybe squat in some form or another, 4 days per week, deadlift 2 or 3. So these higher frequency programs tend to be present much, much more in the lower weight class athletes. Your guys that compete at 165, 180, 198. You don't see it as much on the big heavyweights. And I think part of that is because at those lower weight classes, they're not building any more muscle. They're not getting bigger. And so what lever do they pull? Well, they pull the neurological efficiency lever, because they have the amount of muscle mass that they have is more or less set. They're not gaining any weight. They're staying at 165 or whatever. So the only way for them to increase their total is by goosing that or pulling that neurological efficiency lever, if that makes sense. They have to get better with the amount of muscle mass that they currently have. Guys that are moving up the weight classes over time, that are going from 165 to 181 to 198 to 220, as they're obviously, as they're climbing up the weight class, they're building muscle, and they may not have to pull that neurological efficiency lever as hard as a lower weight class.
They don't have the same constraint. Yep, for sure.
Right. So does that make sense?
No, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
No, it makes sense. And so now we're talking about so today I want to focus on intermediate lifters, general population, right? We're going to assume that the stuff about strength holds for a ranked beginner. Just get stronger, do something like starting strength, you're good. Now the question is,
let me give you real quick.
Okay.
I want to give one more example of this that this audience might be more familiar with. This is something that I've meant to point out in a couple of different places that I have it. But guys will notice often if they've been, let's say they're squatting twice a week or once a week, and you give them you plug in a light squat day somewhere in the middle, they will immediately start to see improvements on their heavy day. So let's just say they've been squatting heavy on Mondays, and that's it. And maybe they're having a hard time progressing on their squat. And then you stick a light squat day. So something like 3 sets of 5 at 60%. It's not very heavy. It's a medium amount of volume. You stick that in on say Thursday. Within 2 to 3 weeks, a lot of times their heavy day squat starts to improve. Why is that? Well, they didn't get bigger by adding in 3 sets of light squats later in the week. That's not a very hypertrophy oriented protocol. But what did it do? It immediately, that's why I was saying this adaptation is transient. It immediately increased neurological efficiency by having that added day, that increased frequency. Now they're squatting every 2 or 3 days instead of once every 7 days. And that adaptation occurs pretty quickly. The system gets more efficient really, really quick. And so that's why that even that added light squat day, that's why it improves performance almost immediately, because that neurological efficiency thing can be manipulated in pretty short order, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it actually brings up another question, because you addressed this toward the end of your last show. You were talking about bro splits versus high frequency programs for intermediate lifters. And it kind of brings that question to mind of, this is getting more popular now, Andy, right? You've probably heard it. Jeff Nippard made it popular 3 years ago when he was experimenting with it. And now I see it coming up again. My own community is asking about it. Why not do a 5-day full body program? And you kind of addressed it on your show, but one of the reasons I hear the science guys saying it could be more effective is there's a diminishing point of return with the number of sets. So like if you do a typical bro split, you're hitting say 15 to 20 hard sets across that muscle group in one session. Whereas if you do high frequency, you might hit 6 to 8, and 8 is kind of that point of diminishing returns. And so therefore you're able to get more effective reps across the week. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I don't think that some of it depends on how you define like a hard set. I kind of reject the idea that anybody responds well to say 20 sets per week, 20 hard sets per week on any muscle group. Somebody that, in my opinion, somebody that feels like they need 20 sets, the exception might be back training, but you're actually talking about different muscle groups. That's actually not one muscle group. It gets lumped in, but that would be the only case where I would say that somewhere close to 20 sets could potentially be effective. But say for like the quads, anybody that needs 20 sets of direct quad work in order to grow their quads is simply not training hard.
Okay.
And so there's an assumption that you have to either accept or reject it when you talk about volume, and that is relative intensity. How close to failure is optimal? If you accept, as I do, it's going to change your opinion on this. So some of it just depends on if we agree or disagree on this. You're going to have a different opinion on volume and frequency. But if you accept that higher RPE training, if we want to use that term, or training closer to failure is more effective for muscle growth, then that is going to reduce the amount of volume that you're capable, that you either can do or should do, and by extension frequency. So I operate under the premise that, and a lot of the current research supports this, and I think most bodybuilders have always kind of known this or accepted this, that training closer to failure is the superior stimulus for hypertrophy versus training very far away from failure. So taking your sets right up to the point where you can't do another rep is more effective than leaving 3 or 4 reps in the tank. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of depends on where you fall on that. But if you accept that, if you say, well, training closer to failure is superior, then you're going to have a different calculation for how much volume is optimal. You cannot, like on the quads, you cannot take your sets to failure and also do 20 sets per week. Whether you do it all in one workout or spread load it out, it's just not going to work. And so that's going to impact the volume calculation. So what was your question?
That was the question. I kind of wanted to get that out of the way just because I know I've had some questions on it as well. You basically addressed it. There's 2 other things you mentioned on that show I wanted to bring up. One is it leaves no room for error. Like you have to get everything perfect.
Right. And I don't like when I say, well, if you're doing 20 sets per week, you're just not training hard. And I'm not saying that because it's like, well, you're not, you're just a pussy. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's actually because I believe that
Right.
that harder training taken
Closer
your
to
steps
failure,
closer
yeah.
to failure is actually more effective. And I to the degree where I think that should be primary, and then the amount of volume that you do is subservient to that. And so
Yep.
I think a lot of these guys have it backwards, where if they believe that volume is the most
Just
important thing,
yeah.
if you believe that volume is the most important thing, then you're going to reduce intensity in order to get more volume.
Mhm.
But if you believe that higher effort training and progressive overload is primary, then volume and frequency become subservient to that. Does that make sense?
To intensity
So,
and training to
so
failure. Yeah.
yeah. So there can be a fundamental disagreement depending on which side of the line that you fall on. But one of the most fundamental rules of programming is that intensity, both absolute intensity, so load, or you could expressed as a percentage of 1 RM, or relative intensity, which is more effort level. So your RPE or RIR, however you want to do it, intensity is inversely related to volume. So as intensity goes up, volume goes down, and vice versa. So I tend to believe that progressive overload and higher effort training is more important than the total. I do think there's a minimum threshold of volume that has to be met. But I think the volume and the frequency is subservient to the other factors.
And it's interesting. I believe there have been a lot of studies, if we want to talk about science, that look at fat loss phases and which ones hold on to the most muscle, and it tends to be the ones with the higher intensity, right?
Sure.
And it kind of gives you a good look of what's important when you're especially in an energy starved environment, if that's the thing that kind of keeps it going. Okay, so I want to talk about goals for a second, because I want to get into your bodybuilding style programming, some of the details of it, and the bro splits and back off, top set back off and all that. But I was just talking to my friend Tony on the way over here, and he's like, what are your goals for next year? And I'm like, my goals are just to progress as much as I can on this bodybuilding program. Like, I don't have PRs that I'm trying to hit necessarily, having had surgery not long ago. But that does raise the question, once you're intermediate advanced, why would you run this bodybuilding program, right? What are the goals that you see from your clients so people don't run the wrong thing for their goals?
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing is when you're trying to talk about, like, and again, I'm talking bodybuilding with a small b, so not necessarily competitive, but still, it doesn't do any good to talk about this. If somebody says, well, I don't really want to be that big or that strong, I just want to be fit or whatever, then none of this stuff really matters, because you can basically do anything with any modicum of effort, and that's going to satisfy those goals. But if you're talking about, I want to be as big as possible and have as well developed a physique as possible, even if I'm not, obviously, if you're competing, then that kind of goes without saying. You want to be as big and as well developed as possible. Even if you're not competing, though, and you say, oh, I just want to have the best possible physique out there, then one of the fundamental differences between that type of training, bodybuilding training, and powerlifting is that with powerlifting, there's only 3 exercises that you have to do, right? But with bodybuilding, you have to train everything. Everything has to be trained. You could, as a powerlifter, you could go your whole career, never do any work for your side delts, never do any work for your calves, never do work for your biceps. There's a whole lot of stuff you could ignore completely and still be a really good powerlifter. As a bodybuilder, you can't really do that. And that's why, there's really the whole concept of, say, assistance exercises doesn't exist in bodybuilding. It's all important. Like, your side delt work is potentially just as important as your chest work. If you've got, if you want to be as big as possible and you have underdeveloped shoulders, especially if you're going to step on stage, you can't have underdeveloped side delts, right? You can't have underdeveloped calves or no biceps, so there's no body part or no area of your body that can be ignored, which means everything has to be trained hard and with adequate volume. And it's really hard to do that in the context of a full body split. So training your full body 3 days per week, or even like an upper lower split. It's so energy intensive to do the type of bodybuilding training that you necessarily, just from a practical standpoint, even of just time management, that those things have to be split up into their own, let's say, their own days, or at least they have to be given adequate amount of time and energy in the workout. If you're doing a full body split and you do squats and then you do bench presses, and then you do bent over rows on Monday, you're kind of at the end of by the time you do all three of those lifts and you do all three of them with, the amount of volume that they need and the amount of effort and the amount of effort that they require, the progressive overloading over time, like it doesn't leave a whole lot else in the workout. There's not a whole lot of room for other stuff. And to the extent that you will do other things, they're going to be half-assed. Like for most people, especially as you get stronger, squatting, benching, and bent over rows all in the same workout, you're probably pushing an hour and a half, right? And so whatever you do after that is, even if you're trying to push hard, you're just not going to be able to devote the amount of energy and effort level into those sessions in a practical way. So it makes some sense to at least split things up, say into upper body, lower body. But even then, again, as you get stronger and more advanced, you also develop the ability to fatigue yourself a lot more. And so it may be difficult to bench, bent over row, shoulder press, dips, 5 or 6 different movements, all for different muscle groups. Those workouts become both very long because you have to warm up new movements. So you have to move from benching to rowing. There's a whole warm up process for moving to that a completely different muscle group. Mm-hmm. And that just the time and the energy spent just on that upper body workout may not allow you to give adequate attention to all the areas of your body that need development. And so there's a natural progression. I kind of went over this in my last podcast episode of, what that progression might look like of a guy. Yeah, even if he wants to be a bodybuilder, let's just say we take some kid who wants to be a bodybuilder on day one, but he's never been in the weight room. I'd still probably start him out with like a 3-day-a-week full body program because he doesn't necessarily need at the beginning to have a dedicated arm day or whatever. He can just kind of hit those big rocks and get stronger on those, and he's going to see progression in his physique. But then as he gets stronger and he wants to continue to put on even more muscle, he's probably going to have to split things up into like an upper body, lower body. And then at a certain point, he may have to split that up into like a legs push pull. And then at a certain point, he may have to split up, it didn't used to be common, but it's becoming more common now to say split up quads and hamstrings. If you've got a squat, leg press, and leg extension, it's hard to move from that into stiff leg deadlifts and be able to put in what I'm saying? So a lot of guys will wind up splitting up their lower body work, and then you get to the point where, okay, my arm development sucks. Well, you're doing triceps after chest and shoulders, and you just don't have the time or the energy to devote enough volume and intensity to those movements. And I think if you're going to really maximize physique development, you have to treat all of your movements, even the little movements, the tricep extensions, the curls, the side delt work, those have to be trained with an adequate amount of, again, volume and effort level and progressive overload. And it becomes a matter of resources, of time and energy. How do you do that without splitting it up? And so I think that's where bodybuilders naturally, over a course of a couple of years, are going to evolve into some sort of body part split by necessity.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And your specific program of 6 days, when I first saw it, I was thinking, man, that sounds like a lot. And then once you run it, you realize it makes a lot of sense, especially for us older guys who have less recovery. It actually worked out really well for time management as well. So I'll give you an example. For me, my rest day is Wednesday, right? Your program is a 6-day program. For me, that's 4 days a week training, just like I was always doing on something like a conjugate or upper lower. And then I can work on the weekends. And many of us have flexibility to do that on the weekends. You also only have 3 or 4 movements. So like this morning doing flat bench, incline bench, cable fly, and then I think I threw in abs or something. You're over in 45, 60 minutes. It doesn't feel crazy, but you were able to be fresh for each of those movements. Even the cable flies, I was able to be fresh for those. So it's a great strategy.
The workouts are shorter, and they're also less systemically stressful because all of the stress is being directed at one area of the body. I mean, when you do a squat, a bench press, and a deadlift, or a squat, a bench, and a barbell row, or something like that, you're working way more of your body. The workouts take longer, and I think there's a trade-off there between the length of the workouts and your ability to recover. That even if you're training more often, say 5 or 6 days per week, if the workouts are shorter and less energy intensive, it's actually quite sustainable. And I get and that's why I have it in my primer, okay, I know there's going to be a good portion of you guys that can't do 6 days per week.
Right.
But here's an option for 5, here's an option for 4 that still kind of holds to the same principles. I mean, you don't necessarily have to do 6. I lay that out as here's the way to split it up, maximally, and then you can kind of condense that down as needed. And some of that's going to be based on you, and certainly with advanced bodybuilders, all of those guys will train based on weaknesses. Most guys, and weaknesses and strengths. So certainly at the higher levels, like guys that are going to compete in bodybuilding, they're going to have a certain, there's going to have a certain amount of genetics that predisposes them to be good in that. And part of that is most guys will have 1 or 2 body parts that are pretty well developed with a minimal amount of work, and certain 1 or 2 body parts that don't develop as well that require more work. So to some degree, the split that you derive is going to be based on your own individual weaknesses or just areas that you want to prioritize. So your movement, if you've got an awesome lower body, then maybe you don't have to split up quads and hams. Like if you or you just don't care that much about it. Or if you've got, like me, I still train my arms directly, but I've got genetically probably a fairly gifted set of arms that if I wouldn't necessarily have to train them by themselves. I could tack on triceps at the end of chest and biceps at the end of back and still have reasonably good developed set of arms. But somebody that doesn't have that really, especially if they're going to compete and they've got very small arms, they're going to need they're not going to be able to get as good a result doing triceps after they do chest and shoulders and doing biceps after back. Like they're going to benefit from having their own day dedicated to just direct bicep and tricep work, where again, an adequate amount of volume, effort, and load can be dedicated to those muscle groups.
So let's continue on that with the specialization then. If someone were to run your 6-day program, which is, I'll call it a balanced program, right? And I know women, I don't know if it's geared toward men or women, but women tend to like more lower body work in their program. And yours has 2 lower body days, 4 upper body, which I kind of like about it, because as a percentage of the week, the dreaded days are smaller percentage.
Yeah.
But if somebody had weaker legs or women or whatever, how would you make a tweak to this?
Well, part of that is women tend to recover better than men. Men, and that's not that they have some superhuman ability to recover. Women are not as good as men at generating the same amount of stress. Men, because of that, we have higher levels of motor unit recruitment. We have more ability to fatigue ourselves than do women. So it's not that they recover better. They create stress not as well as we do, if you want to express it like that. They don't create as much stress, so they tend to recover. Like women can operate at a far higher, like on strength work, they will do their volume work on a strength-based program at a far higher percentage of 1RM. Like women can do volume work at 90% of 1RM a lot of times. Men can't do that, and it's not that they recover better. It's just that their 1RM is not as, because they lack the neurological efficiency that men. The same thing happens, honestly, and this is one thing I know like your audience here and mine too is not into the drug use and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But the same thing happens with guys that are taking a lot of anabolic steroids. Steroids actually don't make you recover faster. They make your output in the workout that much more. Like your neurological efficiency goes through the roof. So you actually generate a ton more stress during the workout. And I think that's part of the reason why you don't see IFBB pros training their legs 3 days per week or training their chest 3 days a week. People always say, well, they recover better, they can do much higher workloads. That's actually not true. And they don't actually do more volume. They generate more, they create a more significant stress with their training, and their adaptation to that stress is more profound. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's stimulus and fatigue ratios higher.
But their recovery is not better. If you take a steroid user and have him train legs 3 days per week, he won't be able to recover from that. So actually someone who's less neurologically efficient could get away with training their legs 3 days per week. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see.
And so if you have that spectrum, if you want to, if you wanted to have like a 3-part spectrum, at one end of the spectrum, you would have, this is a very oversimplified version, but on one end of the spectrum, you would have, women. On the middle, you would have non-enhanced males. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you would have enhanced males in terms of neurological efficiency. The closer you are to the female side of that spectrum, the more volume and frequency you tend to be able to do because you're generating less stress at every workout. Does that make sense?
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. And so that's, I don't know where I was going with that. Oh, for women. Yeah. So women, you might be able to put in, 3 leg days or instead of splitting up, say, even if they kept 2 leg days in there, which I would probably do, I would probably keep 2 leg days in there, but you might hit quads and hams hard on both of those days. Like they might, instead of splitting up quads and like they could get away with a higher volume leg workout twice per week as opposed to splitting things up.
Got it. That's good to know. So then if somebody like, let's say a guy wanted to specialize in any particular body part, is that a similar approach where they would take the day that's focused on that part and just add, are they adding intensity or are they adding another movement in there?
So the way that I do it is just like the way that I have 2 specialization programs on my website. I have an arm specialization program and a shoulder specialization program. I'll probably write some other ones, but those are just the 2 that I started with because I have a little bit more familiarity with designing those. So I've got more feedback from customers and clients and stuff with those. But the first thing that I do is I don't look at saying, okay, how can we just blow up the amount of volume and frequency that we do? That's not my primary. My primary actually, let's say with the arm specialization program, is with the training stimulus itself. How can we optimize the amount of stress that this person can put onto their biceps and triceps? So I prioritize that during the week. One is I proceed that day with rest. So I may give them those Saturday and Sunday off, right? What I do is I bracket the area of the body that we want to prioritize. I bracket that on both ends with rest. So let's say Saturday and Sunday, I'm going to give them an off day. And then Monday, we're going to hit their arm training. And we're going to do, so that way they are fresh. They're not coming into that workout sore or tired. They're fresh so that they can maximize loading, effort level, enthusiasm, even volume into that workout. And then the next day I would do legs followed by another rest day. So they actually get two rest days on either side of that workout. And then later in the week, let's say Thursday, we would do like chest and shoulders and maybe one other tricep movement in there. So I goose that frequency a little bit by giving them one really, really hard day of tricep training, say on Monday, and then touch it again later in the week. And then the same thing, like we do like a back day on Friday with a little bit of bicep work.
My name is Tony. I'm a strength lifter in my 40s. Thank you to Phil and his Wits and Weights community for helping me learn more about nutrition and how to implement better ideas into my strength training. Phil has a very, very good understanding of macros and chemical compounds and hormones and all that, and he's continuously learning. That's what I like about Phil. He's got a great sense of humor. We'll go back and forth. He's very relaxed, very easy to talk to. One of the greatest things about Phil, in my view, is that he practices what he preaches. He also works out with barbells. He trains heavy, not as heavy as me, but he trains heavy, he lifts, so he knows programs, he knows different variations. So if you talk with him about getting in better shape or eating better, he's probably going to give you some good advice, and I would strongly recommend you talk with him and help you out. Thanks.
And I think where a lot of guys go wrong is they say, well, I want to develop my arms. So I'm going to have 3 dedicated arms. I'm going to train my arms heavy and hard and high volume Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I'm just going to go ape shit with volume and frequency and effort, and I'm just going to annihilate my arms. 1, it doesn't work that well because recovery is not going to be good. 2, there's going to be interference effects on the other upper body work that you do. So when you do chest, shoulder work, back work, where are you going to put that in? If you're training, it's like you're going to be now, instead of like letting your arms rest and recover after you bomb the shit out of them, you got to go right into like a chest day or a back day or whatever. And so you're training
jello arms. Yeah.
Yeah. You're training those damaged muscles. And I think like in order for a muscle to grow, it needs adequate stimulus and it needs adequate rest. The way to do it is to maximize the stimulus, but not necessarily through just bombarding that muscle with more volume and more frequency. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I was wondering in the context, even though of the 6-day program, are you already maxed out effectively and you're talking about now substitutions for specialization? Or do you take the day where you're focusing on that one body part, now you have 2 days around at that don't have that body part and you can still apply the same approach?
Well, if you do this, like if you do the 6-day, like you said, the 6-day program that I lay out, it's very well balanced. Like if you just take it, if you just look at it, on paper, it pretty well balances everything. But if you wanted to maintain that 6-day program, but you wanted to prioritize, say, your arms, what I would do, you've got the arm day on Friday. On Monday, on your chest day, I would just add a tricep movement after you do your chest work. And then one bicep movement after your back day. And then just keep your arm day in there. So I do move that frequency lever a little bit, but not a ton. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get it. That way you're not interfering with the body part's day itself, and you're putting it far enough away from that day to kind of just hit it a little bit more.
And that's the way that 6-day program is laid out. It allows you to do that with just about any muscle group. I mean, you could do, I think it might be a good idea to so people know what we're talking about, is to actually lay out the 6-day split.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm jumping all over the place. Let's
I
do the split, and then I want to get into things like top set, back off set, which I think is pretty innovative.
So the split, and it kind of, the joke is, Monday is chest day, like everybody. But Monday is chest, Tuesday is back, Wednesday is quads and calves, Thursday is shoulders and traps, Friday biceps and triceps, and Saturday hamstrings, and then calves again, and then Sunday is an off day. So that's pretty well balanced. Like every major muscle group has its own day. But again, the idea though, that like the criticism of a split like that is, well, you're only hitting muscle group once per week. Well, there's a main reason why that's not true. And that's because the effect of overlap. Like overlap is a real thing. Like there's a natural overlap and this is influenced mainly by your exercise selection. So let me lay that out a little bit so people can see that even if you're worried about frequency of, you said I'm doing shoulders on Thursday, like I'm only hitting my shoulders once per week. Well, that's not really true. If you look at your chest day, I always have an incline movement on your chest day. It may be the first movement, it may be the second movement, but there's always an incline press on your chest day. All your EMG studies will show that inclines hit the front delts just as well as overhead pressing does. So right there, if you're overhead pressing on Thursday with a machine or dumbbells or barbell, whatever, and then hitting inclines on Monday as part of your chest day, right there, you've got 2 direct stimuli for the front and the side delts. On your back day, any rowing movement that you do, especially rows where you've got, elbows high, you're pulling in line with the chest, that's a tremendous rear delt movement. Like you're going to get a lot of rear delt stimulus from basically all of your rowing movement, and then you're hitting them again in isolation on your shoulder day. So rear delts are getting hit twice per week. Traps might get hit 3 days per week, because I would generally have people do, like, say, a shrug on Thursday, but most of your rowing exercises that you might do on your back day are going to incorporate traps. And then on your hamstring day, I usually have some sort of deadlift variation, a stiff leg deadlift, an RDL, or even a conventional deadlift, all of which are also going to hit the traps. So even though we've got, quote, one on paper, we've got 1 day for doing traps, they're actually getting stimulated 3 days per week. Triceps are going to get hit as many as 4 days per week. You have a direct tricep, workout on Friday, but when you do overhead pressing on your shoulder day, when you do all of your chest pressing movement on Monday, those are hitting your triceps. And if you do certainly things like pullovers, but even things like chins, where there's a lot of shoulder extension work, that actually hits your triceps. So your triceps are actually getting hit 4 days per week, only once really hard and really directly. But that whatever need there is for more frequency is more than covered.
Yeah.
With something like this, and then the leg day is the same thing. Like if you do a quad workout that has squats and leg presses and things like that, there's going to be some hamstring and adductor overlap in there. And then, and again, you can be intentional with this through your exercise selection. If you say, well, I really want to hit my chest a little bit more. All right. Well, when you do on your tricep day, make sure you're incorporating things like close grip, bench pressing, and dips. Like those are effective tricep movements, but there's a ton of overlap on the chest. And so you can very, very easily create a scenario where every muscle group is getting hit a minimum of 2 times per week, even if on paper, it's really only 1 day. And I actually think that's a better way to do frequency than is trying to annihilate every muscle group 2 to 3 days per week. I actually think recovery is better. And the idea that you're somehow going to atrophy or lose muscle mass by, only hitting it hard once per week is not true. Like your triceps are not going to atrophy when they're getting stimulated 4 days per week, even if on 3 of those 4 days it's quote indirect.
For sure. And I'm feeling it. I mean, I'm walking it right now where as soon as something gets hit, maybe 2-3 days later, I feel it again. I feel it again. So it's kind of coming back, but not so frequently that you're training through soreness. And for those of us guys who have like the low back fatigue, I've found this program extremely great for that kind of recovery, even during fat loss. Like, and I know we can talk about that, but just which is counterintuitive to a lot of people because they're thinking 6 days a week. So part of the movements, let's talk about the top set, back off set approach that you incorporate, because I think that's pretty cool. And the fact that not everything is, 3 sets of 8 to 12, right?
Right.
What's behind that?
Well, it is 6 days a week still. Mm-hmm. So you do run the risk as if, even though, like I said, the workouts tend to be shorter, they're less systemically fatiguing, you're still in the gym 6 days a week. And if you overdo things on the volume side of things, it is going to wind up being a whole shitload of work that's going to be hard to recover from. And so you really can't do, 15 or 20, even if it was more effective, which I don't think it is, but even if it was, it still would be very hard to do, say, 15 to 20 sets, per muscle group. Like you would wind up still overtraining to do that. And so again, you have to look at, if you're going to be in the gym 6 days per week, the idea is, yes, you're in the gym 6 days per week, but basically all of your workouts are under an hour. It is possible to run them up a little longer, especially if you take more rest time or you just bullshitting around or whatever.
That's the main reason is you're bullshitting around. That's when they take
It is. But if you're really focused and you really get in there, you get through the warm-up sets, you time your rest periods, and you don't have to rush your rest periods, but you keep track of your rest periods, you stay off your phone, all that kind of stuff. You can get all of these workouts done in under an hour, and so that's really the only way that the 6 day a week program is sustainable over a long period of time, is to keep that volume minimal. And again, if you operate under the notion, like as I do, that your effort level, taking more of your exercises to failure, is an important component of muscle growth, then it limits the amount of volume that you can do in a given workout. You can't do 20 sets of quads and push. You're going to be having way too many of your sets be just sub-maximal junk volume, and is what I would consider. So it winds up being, what I have found as I've gotten both older, but also stronger, and also better at delivering a stress to a given muscle. And that comes through a lot of different things. One, it comes through just mindset. Like, do you have the mental toughness and the grit to really push hard and not rack the bar as soon as it gets hard? Or do you have the grit to really push through that? But I also think that there's as you get stronger and the load increases on all of these exercises, that influences the amount of volume that you can do. But also things like mind-muscle connection and really understanding how muscles work and how things are supposed to feel, and really getting good at, like, all of those lend themselves to being able to generate a high level of stress with less work. And the analogy that I always use, and also exercise selection, also picking and choosing the exercises that deliver the optimal amount of stress to that muscle group through taking it through a full range of motion, having a longer eccentric component, limiting the amount of work that other muscles, like, this is where you could make the argument that a hack squat is actually a better quad developer than, say, like a low bar squat, because of the fact that the quads are doing you're taking the quads through a full range of motion, and it's really only the quads that are doing the work. So when you take that to failure, let's say, or right up to failure, it is your quads that are failing. Right. Versus when you take a deadlift I've played devil's advocate on this for a couple of years now to try to get people to think. When you take a deadlift to failure, what is failing? You don't know, right? It could be any number of things. When you take a Romanian
bottleneck,
when you take a Romanian deadlift to failure, what's failing?
Hamstrings. Yep.
Probably so. You take a leg curl to failure, what's failing? Definitely it's the hamstrings, right? When you take a hack squat to failure, what's failing? The quads. So that starts to get into the whole Mike Israetel concept of the stimulus to fatigue ratio. The stimulus is increasing on that muscle group, but the overall amount of systemic fatigue is less. So by choosing better exercises, doing the exercises in the right manner from a mechanical standpoint, when you do a hack squat, having your feet low and narrow on the platform versus high and wide on the platform makes it harder on the quads. So when you start to manipulate your exercise selection to be more stressful on the muscle that you're trying to target, you're going to need less volume.
Makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
And then you couple that with extremely high effort level, you can do one all-out set of hack squats is potentially more. Here's an even better comparison. A hack squat versus a front squat, a barbell front squat. Like, people love to point at front squats as like the preeminent quad movement. I don't think that it necessarily is, because most people fail a front squat because of their inability to hold the bar on their, like, it's not their quads that fail. It's usually their abs or their low back or their upper back. Like, you're so limited by something that doesn't have anything to do with the movement that it makes it not as good of an exercise. So you probably can't do just one all-out set of front squats and get the same stimulus as you would do one all-out set of hack squats, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And as you're saying this, I'm thinking of all the different techniques you have programmed in. I was looking at just the last week alone on squat day. After some sort of front squat or safety bar squat, you had a single all-out set of, I don't know what was programmed in there. I did a Platz squat, but it was the same intent. It was to hit your quads really hard just for one set. You also have almost every day the top set, back off set, where it's just 2 sets, but you're doing it at a heavy range and then more of a hypertrophy, like, a higher rep range. So then there's the DC method. There's all these things that you incorporate that keep the session short, but really let you hit the muscles.
Yeah, and part of the reason that works coupled with the right exercise selection. So when you're doing movements that really allow you to target the muscles that you're trying to work, you take the muscles to a full range of motion. They can be loaded progressively over time. They have a longer eccentric component, all of those sorts of things that put they're not limited by other muscle groups. All of those things are going to reduce the amount of volume that you're going to need, because it's a better tool. It's a more stimulative tool. And so I think that's a part of where, that comes from and I found that with those types of movements, you can generate more than enough stress with 2 all-out sets. And I typically will that's just one of those things that it just comes through trial and error of, you do one kind of one set to kind of maximize loading in that like 4 to 8 rep range, and then strip some weight off and do a second set, like maybe in the 8 to 12 rep range. And you push both of those sets maximally, you're pretty well done with that movement after that.
It's hard, man. It's hard. You think it's easy on paper, or some people do, but it's if you're pushing the right load, it's tough.
And part of that is I look at this, and this is something that I borrowed kind of from the sprinting world, is when you're looking at how many sets to do on an exercise, is how much performance drop off is there from one set to the next to the next. And if you're losing a significant amount of performance ability from one set to the next, you're really pissing in the wind, or just piling up fatigue with less stimulus. So like, if you put on 3 plates on a hack squat machine, 4 plates, whatever it is, and you push, one all-out set of, let's say, 12 reps, and it's just, that 12th rep, you could just barely get it. You took that, you could not have gotten a 13th rep. If you rest, say, 3 to 5 minutes and do another set at that same load, what's going to happen to your reps? Well, they're going to drop down to like 6 or 7. Like, you're going to have a massive. So I look at that as, I'm not really creating any new significant stress with that additional set. All I'm doing is compiling fatigue. And it's the same way sprint coaches tend to look at track workouts, is that once speed drops off at a certain amount of repetitions, let's say you're training a guy for a 100-meter sprint or whatever, once the speed drops below a certain threshold, they're not training speed anymore. So they're going to cut the workout off. Does that make sense? So it's not an exact perfect analogy, but it's something I feel like carries over to the bodybuilding or strength world or whatever. Is like, a certain amount of performance drop off is a good way to learn what your cutoffs should be volume wise. So I found that like 2, that's why I like the 1 heavy top set followed by the 1 lighter back off set. Take both of them maximally, and then that's it. Like, you've pretty much, it's time to move on to a different exercise. Like, I've extracted everything that I'm going to get from that particular movement, and I'm going to get more benefit from just moving on to a different exercise.
Yeah. And just how much more time do you have, by the way?
I got plenty of time.
Okay.
I'm good.
Yeah. And it's not like everything is like that, because you'll have pre-exhaustion, I guess, is what you're going for when you start with a lighter movement. Let's say lateral raises on shoulder day. You might start with that, and it might be 3-4 sets, and then you might even have, say, pull-ups or chin-ups on back day, and you might have 5 sets. So it's some places it makes sense, right, to have
because
higher volume.
And that's just like the pull-up thing. Like that comes directly from my own kind of training experience. This funny thing happens to me on pull-ups is, like, let's say the first set that I do, I get like 10 or whatever. And then I do a second set and I might get like 7. But then I can do a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth set. Yeah. It never drops off. And I think, again, that's not that the back has some superhuman ability to recover better. It's that it's harder to generate the same level of stress on, say, a pull-up. Like, you're not actually taking that muscle to absolute and complete failure in the same way that, say, a hack squat does to the quads. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
no, it does. And I've always wondered that too. It's like, am I not training hard enough in the previous sets, or is it just recovering that much?
Yeah, it's the same thing like with a lateral raise or something like that. Like, you can't load those things up very much. So there's like an inability to just progress and load. And there's also, because they're so mechanically disadvantaged, is that it's actually hard to really create a ton of stress where that muscle group is just done. Like, it's exhausted. Like, you could, like on the pecs, the quads, even the hamstrings to some extent, like not all muscle groups are the same. Like, it's not that the muscle groups are different. It's just that the movements themselves are harder to generate the same amount of fatigue, or like even like with back, like a barbell row or something like that. Like you don't actually really hit like true failure. It becomes like technical failure. Like, things just get really, really sloppy. Whereas like on a bench, or a chest press, you're going, and then like all of a sudden, boom, like it just stops. Like, no force can be generated from that. Like, and part of that's just your positioning, like the way that you're locked in, you can truly take that muscle to failure. So like pecs, quads, things like that tend to be easier to actually take to like true failure. Whereas other exercises, pull-ups, lateral raises, certain other things, you just can't generate enough stress with a low volume. So I tend to operate at a little bit higher volume there to get this same equivalent amount of work in.
And let me ask you about that. For a newer lifter, not a newer lifter, but a lifter new to this style of training, there's the mind-muscle connection, there's the tempo, there's things like that. When I think of a lateral raise, sometimes I have to remind myself, just slow down, take it easy, and really pull with the delt. Like, don't get too much of the traps involved. Don't like use too much momentum. And then you realize you don't have to go as heavy either. Like, what are your thoughts on helping someone get to that point through their training so they're really lifting effectively?
Well, one, it takes time. Like, mind-muscle connection takes time. I do think that it matters. Like, a lot of people say, well, that doesn't really matter. It absolutely matters. Like you're going to get, like, if you come off of a set of lateral raises and your side delts are just blown up and they're pumped and they're burnt, like, you're going to get better growth than the guy who comes off a set of lateral raises that's like, what does this work? Like, I don't like, you know what I mean? And that's how most like beginners are, especially with like back work. They'll come off of a pull down machine. They have no sensation whatsoever that their lats were worked. Like,
it's all their arms, right? Or something.
Yeah. It's all their forearms or biceps or anything other than their lats.
Yeah.
Right. But a more advanced guy, he's going to come off of a pull down machine or whatever, and he's going to come off of that, and his lats are going to be burning and blown up. Like, it's easier on certain muscle groups. Like, you don't have to teach mind muscle connection on a leg extension. Like, you put somebody on a leg extension machine and have them bang out 10 or 15 reps, whether they're a more gifted athlete or not, their quads are going to be burning, right? They're going to be pumped. They're going to be burning. Like, there's no doubt like what muscle group is doing that work, but that's just because of the mechanical nature of that lift. It locks you in to the point where there is no other muscle group that can contribute to that movement other than the quads. And so it's easy to establish that mind muscle connection on that. Whereas something that's really, really form dependent, like a lateral raise or most of your rowing exercises or pull downs, guys do those for years and never really feel their back. And it takes time to do that. And then once you start to develop that mind muscle connection, and then you pair that up with loading and effort level and all that sort of thing, then it becomes even more effective because you're really, really aware of like what you're targeting and how to slightly manipulate your grip or your back angle or the touch point of the bar so that you can really, really feel the muscle that you're trying to work. And I don't think that's an unimportant thing, because if you're trying to do a movement, like, are we just trying to row, or are we trying to hit the lats or the upper back or whatever? Like, and you need to learn those types. So one is just time, but two, I think like machine exercises can be really helpful on this. Like, you're going to learn, like on a chest supported seated row machine, you're going to learn how to feel your back on that more so than you will on a barbell row. Like, and then you can take the lesson that you like, how to really squeeze the scapula and like really feel all the musculature of your back and your lats and stuff working on that chest supported machine row, which is a more simple movement. Now you take that mind muscle connection that you've developed there and try to translate that into a more complex movement like a barbell row. So sometimes, like, just stepping back and we think of like a barbell row as like a basic movement, but really like a chest supported machine row would actually be more basic in that regard, in terms of it will really teach you the proper mechanics of rowing. Like, you'll develop that mind muscle connection faster on that. And actually, like on like lateral raises or something like that, like one of the best ways to kind of learn is like on one of those seated lateral raise machine, where it really teaches you like you're because most guys, like on a lateral raise, if you watch them, they're focused on the dumbbell. So they're focused on the dumbbell getting up high, but not their humerus. And the job of the side delt is to actually elevate the humerus up. So like learning how to do that, but with a dumbbell held out in your hand. So you're not just swinging the weight around, you're actually using the side delt to abduct the humerus. Like that's like, so just like learn some of it is just intellectual understanding of anatomy and muscle function. Like what is this muscle? What is it actually trying to do? Like on a chest, like your chest, like the role of the pec is not to press the bar out, it's to adduct the humerus. It's actually, so like a fly is actually technically a more direct pectoral stimulus than say a bench press. But if you understand that what the pec's role in the bench press is to, I don't know if people can see, but like if your arm is, abducted out here and you're trying to draw it closer to the midline of your body, like that's the role of the pec. So if you can think about that while you're bench pressing, it's going to enhance that mind muscle connection in your chest pressing movements, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so like
probably better for the shoulders too, because you're not trying to like fling the shoulders forward.
Yeah, or like even certain things like I've made the argument before, like I actually think bench pressing is a good pec developer, but not in the same way that a powerlifter might bench press. Like powerlifters, powerlifters are focused on moving the most amount of weight from point A to point B, not to try to stimulate the pecs. And so a powerlifter might take a really wide grip, have a big arch, and lower the bar down low onto the torso and hit even like in the upper abs. Like if they've got a little belly, like actually hitting in the upper abs, or like far below, the sternum, like might actually be a stronger bench. But if you look at what is the pec doing in that movement, sometimes it's not doing that much as if you lowered your arch a little bit, touch the bar up a little bit higher and focus more on the actual function of the chest. Like that actually makes for that's the argument that like a hammer strength chest press machine is better than a barbell bench press. That would be the argument because it actually takes the pec through a fuller and more natural range of motion than does a barbell. But if you're aware of muscle function, you can kind of manipulate those movements a little bit to get better contractions out of them.
Yeah.
And so that's a part of that as well. So
I think it's very important, all of this, because, people listening, I think a lot of people treat accessory or I know we're not calling them that, but these isolation movements as easy, right? It's just, you just go through the motions, treat them as technical as a low bar back squat and really learn the anatomy.
Almost even more so. Like I tell my guys that like when I have an online client, that's more interested in hypertrophy, I'll be like, all right, this is our first week together, first couple of weeks. Like I want you to send me videos. And it's like what the videos that they send me are like the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, right? Like the big movements. But I don't see videos of their lateral raises and their curls and their tricep stuff. But I'm like, no, I want to see that too, because actually the technical execution of those movements is just as important, if not more important than the big lifts. Like on a squat, I don't teach mind muscle connection on a squat. Like I teach mechanics, right? Like, but on, some other movement, I'm going to be more focused on like learning, like making sure that guy is really, really technically executing that movement well and feeling that movement where he's supposed to be feeling it. So it is like mechanically the little stuff, it's just as important, if not more important than the big stuff. And that's where, again, yeah, the idea that, and even for a power lifter, like if you're going to be doing these bodybuilding style accessory movements to support your squat, bench, and deadlift, you still need to do them almost with the same mindset that a bodybuilder does. Like it's not less important for them, because the idea is still you're doing tricep extensions to what? To build muscle in your triceps. It's the same reason a bodybuilder would do it. So like the technical execution definitely matters. And I think the better you get at the technical execution and the more mind-muscle connection you can develop, and again, you couple that with increased strength, more mental toughness or grit or whatever you want to call it, more of a comfort level pushing to failure and beyond, then that starts to cut down on the amount of volume that you would need to do. Here's
more and more for the work.
Here's a great analogy that I love to use in terms of, if you have a guy, like let's say we have a board, we have a 2x4, and the object is to hammer the nail into this 2x4. And I give you a nail and I give you a big old heavy crescent wrench. And I say, all right, hammer that nail into can you do that? Yeah. And how many times do you need to hit the nail to drive it all the way into the board? Maybe 70 times, right? And so if you're using a bad tool for this task, you may come to the conclusion, well, it takes 70 strikes to drive a nail into this board. But what if I take the crescent wrench away and I give you a hammer? Mm-hmm. Well, now you just drove it in 15 hits, right? Maybe you're not a good craftsman, right? So you still have to hit this nail 15 times, but now you have a better tool, right? Then this is exercise selection. You have a better tool. It takes less volume, less number of strikes to accomplish the same exact task because you have a more efficient tool. Now give that good hammer to some guy that's been a carpenter for 20 years. You ever see those guys drive a nail? It's like my dad, yeah. Boom. It always pissed me off because like we would be doing fencing or something, and my dad would take it and boom, boom, 2 hits and the nail's driven. And it took me 8 times, to drive that same nail because of the skill. And that's the same thing. He's using a better tool, but he has more skill. And so in the hand, the right tool in the hands of a more skilled person, it's going to take less strikes or less volume, if you want to call it that, to accomplish the same task. And I think it's the exact same thing with training, is that a stronger, more efficient user of a good tool can get the same benefit from a hell of a lot less work.
Yeah. And this is training. Like that's the point. Even the bodybuilding stuff is training. So treat it like that skill. And it's a good reminder to me too, when I get up and go in tomorrow to really make the most out of my time. But so besides that, what are some of the other mistakes you see people making on this style program?
I think I don't want to call it a mistake, but
learning opportunities.
Yeah. Well, it's a mindset shift in a way. I think it can be very difficult for guys who maybe they're coming from a strength background or whatever. They've put a certain amount of time into their squat, bench, and their deadlift, their 1RMs and these lifts, and when they make a shift, they say, okay, well, now I want to do hypertrophy or bodybuilding or whatever. Your 1RM is not, again, because of the things that we talked about in the beginning of this episode, which was that the neurological efficiency, your 1RM is very much going to be influenced not just by the amount of muscle mass that you have, but also the amount of volume and frequency that you do on that particular lift. So if you reduce that, and you switch to a slightly different style of training, like it is possible that your 1 rep max is going to go down because you're not training in a way that prioritizes that, because you're not focused on that neurological development of just a given lift. And so there sometimes can be a mindset shift and it's not that strength doesn't matter in a bodybuilding side. It does. It's just 1RM strength in the squat, bench, and deadlift is not the key component for developing more muscle mass. And so when I say strength is still a part of muscle building, you have to get bigger to get stronger, but you also have to get stronger to get bigger. It's a loop that feeds itself. And so, but what we're now talking about is that maybe your 5 to 8 rep max in a hack squat is actually more important to quad development than your 1 rep max low bar squat is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's,
you have
so
to focus on these new lifts and work on progressing them.
And yeah, so there's still the progressive overload is still there. Yeah. It's in a different manner. Like if you start on day 1 of it, you do 8 reps on the hack squat with 2 plates on each side. Like that still has to go up. Like you still need to be able to progress to 8 reps with 3 plates and 8 reps with 4 plates, or, like you're still have to focus on progressive overload and trying to add weight to these movements as often as possible. But that is different than saying I need to work on my 1 rep max on squat, bench, and deadlift, because there's an element to 1 rep maxing that's purely neurological.
Right.
That doesn't factor into bodybuilding. Just like 20 rep sets on squats, there's a cardiovascular or component and a muscular endurance component to getting good at 20 rep sets that has very little to do with muscle growth. So you don't need to worry about that. So that's why like that middle range is the bodybuilding rep range. Like you talk to most bodybuilding coaches, the guys that I respect, the Dante Trudells, the Matt Janssens, the Justin Harrises, all these guys that coach bodybuilders. So I'll tell you the same thing. Like if you had to sum up bodybuilding, it's progressive overload on those middle rep ranges, that 5 to 8, 5 to 12. Some of it's exercise dependent, like certain move, like you're not going to do 5 reps on lateral raises, but like let's just say 5 to 15, and again, that depends somewhat on, but it's really about building strength in that rep range because you get below the 5 rep range, you get into, especially with singles and things like that, there's a neurological component there that is enhanced with methodologies that don't really have that much to do with building muscle.
Right.
If that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Right. Like you don't need to have, like, you don't need to enhance muscle mass. You don't need to have light and medium squat days.
Right.
Like that's a strength those light and medium days are there to enhance neurological efficiency, but aren't going to
for the singles. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not going to do all that much in terms of building muscle mass. So the way that you're going to train for more muscle mass is that progressive overload in those medium rep ranges, pushing to failure, and then exercise selection, just divorcing yourself from the idea that you have to low bar squat, bench press, and deadlift, and that even if you are, you may be performing those movements in a way that actually is like bench pressing. You're going to be able to bench press more weight in a powerlifting style bench. Big arch, wider grip, lower touch point. You're probably going to bench more like that, but you're going to have less stimulus on the pecs.
Yeah.
So it's progressive overload, but done in a certain manner.
And there's still plenty of big lifts on this program. I mean, compound lifts almost every day, regardless.
And I put them in there because I put them in there because one of equipment selection most guys are not necessarily training in Gold's Gym Venice, so they don't have a pendulum squat. And some of the guys do, but I'm trying to set the program up that is in line with most people's equipment situations. I mean, most people that are doing this program, and I say, like, don't do this. If all you have is a barbell and a rack, you're going to struggle with this program. It's hard to shoehorn all that stuff in. Like you need, but most of the guys that are doing this program have a pretty well-equipped home gym or are training in a commercial facility where they have access to machines and cables and things like that, because it does make it easier because the systemic stress is lower with machine type stuff, but the local stimulus can be higher. And so you need to have access to some of these tools that allow you to really, really highly stress the individual muscle groups, but don't create the same level of systemic fatigue. An interesting observation, I talked about this with Dave Tate actually a couple of days ago when I was at Elite FTS, was that when you saw during the pandemic, when everybody was kind of all at once, all these bodybuilders were forced out of their commercial gyms and like into their home gym. Like maybe they had something set up in their garage, like just their old barbell and rack that they haven't used in 20 years. Like they were kind of forced into using like a more basic setup, and they tried to recreate their training program with just barbells. Like a lot of them got injured or overtrained. Like even Matt Janssen, who's like the top bodybuilding coach in the world, like tore his pec, and I think part of that is they're trying to recreate these bodybuilding type splits using nothing but a barbell. And it's not the same thing. Like it's more highly stressful to try to do everything with a barbell, and it's going to be difficult to do, 6 days a week with all the different exercises and everything, trying to recreate it on a barbell. So you need some of these movements in order to do that. And I think so part of it is, if you want to talk about mistakes guys make, is if you really want to get into bodybuilding or, maximal physique development, whatever you want to call it, you're going to have to invest in the appropriate equipment. Like you can't just, so either you're going to have to get a gym membership, or you're going to have to spend some money on developing a really good home gym or whatever. But you can't just say, well, all I have is a bar. How can I do this program? Like that doesn't work. And then the other thing you're going to have to do is divorce yourself from the idea that 1 rep maxing in squat, bench, and deadlift is still the primary goal of the program, because it's not. Like there's going to be, like you've seen it, like there's going to be periods, like I do these 6-week blocks where we don't squat, bench, or deadlift on any of the days. Like I usually will put them in there partly because I know guys want to do it. And if I go too long without letting them bench or squat or deadlift, like they're going to wind up going to something else. But part of that is I'm trying to show guys that yes, you can actually build muscle, and maybe even build muscle better, getting away from these lifts. Like I'm still a fan of, like I make a lot of these arguments that I make about not squatting, benching, and deadlifting. Some of that is devil's advocate stuff, as I'm trying to get people to think about why you might not do that. Right. Like I still think those are good movements. Like I still think deadlifts probably need to be in the program at least part of the year, for maximal development of the back. Like it's just too good of like the loading and everything that you get from deadlifting is hard to replicate with other things. But it's getting guys to think about why we might not deadlift, because I think once you kind of understand that, you're going to understand the program that you're doing better. And that's
definitely opens your mind. Yeah. I like the variety. It's funny. It took me about 3 years of telling my wife what to get me for Christmas to get my home gym to where I could easily do a bodybuilding. Because you need some sort of leg developer, some sort of hack squat, leg press, something or other, all the extra bars, the dumbbells, and it's quite a bit, But so the last thing I want to talk about, because you alluded to it, is the progression. And I'm kind of going to smush 2 or 3 topics in one here. But you've got your 6-week progression with pretty much the same movements on, you've got the 6 days. And then those movements are repeated over 6 weeks, maybe a little bit of shift in rep range, but you're progressing them. Then you have the week deload, and then you go to a new cycle with new movements. Just talk about that a little bit in terms of auto-regulation, and also why it works well on a cut. Because this is like, you usually say this is your number 1 program recommended on a cut.
Well, it is auto-regulated in that, one of the things I think you can make a mistake on a cut is, and you alluded to it earlier in the podcast, which was that, the studies have shown that like the higher RPE training, lower volume, is actually better at preserving muscle mass than doing like a bunch of like low weight volume or whatever. And I think, during a cut, that one of the big mistakes that you can make is trying to do a bunch of volume. You don't have the energy reserves to do that, for one. So doing a ton of volume, if your calories are low, your carbohydrates are lower, like you have to make the most out of what you have. Like neither one of us believe in like no carb diets, but typically in a caloric deficit, your carbs are still going, just because you have to cut calories,
they're going to be low.
And you have to keep the protein up, right? So it doesn't leave a huge budget for a lot of carbohydrates. So you're going to have a limited supply of carbohydrates, and you need to utilize the gas in the tank that you have, right? And you don't want to burn that up. That's why I don't like HIIT protocols necessarily, because I think it burns up too much glycogen. And the same thing happens with like really high volume training. You're burning up too much energy without actually doing the real stimulative work on the muscle mass. So I think there's that. One is just a question of energy resources and trying to be efficient with that. But then also, one of the mistakes that guys make during a cut is it's very difficult to preserve maximal strength on a cut. And that's not really the goal. You're trying to preserve muscle mass, not top end strength. Top end strength is, and you could probably speak to this better than me, but being topped off on carbohydrates has an effect on the nervous system. Like you're going to have better nervous system activity in the presence of more carbohydrates. Like your nervous system is not going to operate as well in a caloric deficit. So trying to focus too much on preserving maximal squat, bench, and deadlift strength, let's say for 1 rep maxes, is kind of a fool's errand. One, it's very hard to do. So you're going to wind up getting overly fatigued, overly frustrated, and worse, potentially opening yourself up to injury. especially if you're late stages in a diet where like in bodybuilding, where you're really low in carbohydrates because you're trying to pull water out and that sort of thing, you're more susceptible to injury. Like that tissue is not as pliable. And so and that's typically where the injuries come from, is maximal loading, especially on things like a squat or something like that. So you want to be careful about trying to get too wrapped up in a diet about preserving top end strength, because it's just not possible, and the risk is high. So you want to say, I want to preserve the maximal amount of muscle mass that I have. And that's easier to do with a program like this because it doesn't take as much to preserve muscle mass. Like if you're working the muscle hard, even at a low volume, you're not going to lose muscle mass. Like you may not gain a lot, and you certainly may not gain as much top end strength, and you may even lose a little bit of strength, but you want to fight to keep as much strength as possible, but in those medium to higher rep ranges. You know what I'm saying? And so a program like this tends to allow you to push as hard as you can at any given workout, but kind of allow whatever happens to happen in terms of, I don't know if that makes sense. So
no, it does. And it's funny because
if we just work within a range, like I may just say, I want you to perform one all out set in the 4 to 8 rep range on a bench. Like that's like, as long as if you do that, regardless of what the load is, but you take as much load as you can and push hard in that 4 to 8 rep range. And then you take a little off the bar and do one additional set as hard as you can, right up to failure in the 8 to 12 rep range. You're not going to lose muscle mass with that type of approach. You may not gain that much strength, but you're not going to lose. And that's when you're dieting, the idea is to trim as much fat off as possible, but preserve as much muscle as possible. And so a protocol like this helps with that. Also, there's some evidence, I think, both in the literature as well as just anecdotal. And this is really into whether you're dieting or bulking or maintaining or whatever. The harder you're pushing on your exercises, so the more you're pushing your sets to failure and that sort of thing, the quicker you're going to plateau on those movements. Like you're going to hit a wall faster on those. And so there's a need to rotate out to different movements. Whereas if you're training more powerlifting style and you're doing much more of your work sub-maximally, like you can, because a lot of like my powerlifting programs, and it seems counterintuitive, but a lot of the work is sub-maximal work, more sets and that sort of thing sub-maximally. And you can actually sustain. That's actually the only way, if you want to train squat, bench, and deadlift year round, like most of your work is going to actually wind up being sub-maximal. That's the only way to sustain it. But if you're pushing your exercise, if you're pushing to failure on these movements or right up to failure, you'll actually find that you hit plateaus and burn out those movement patterns faster. And so that you need to rotate out to new exercises. Bodybuilders have been doing that for decades.
Yeah.
Some guys will do it phasically. So they'll do it in phases. They're going to, start their chest day with an incline press, and they're going to do that as long as possible until it kind of burns out and they're not making any more progress. And then they'll switch over to flat bench or to incline with dumbbells or something like that. Or, what is more common in bodybuilding programs traditionally is guys switch out all the time. And sometimes it's just completely auto-regulated. So this week I started with incline. The next week I started with bench. The next week I started with dumbbell inclines or whatever. And that looks, if you're familiar with like the conjugate method, it's the same exact principle. Like the most bodybuilding programs is the conjugate method. I talked with Dave Tate about this last week. It's going to be on the podcast, but they don't call it that in bodybuilding, but it's the same principle.
Right.
When you do the conjugate method, what we're at, and this is a powerlifting program, but what we ask you to do is say every week you're going to max out for a 1 rep max on a bench press variation. Okay. Now, why do we use variation? Why don't we say every Monday we're just going to max out on the bench press? Because if you max out on the bench press every week, you're going to regress. Like you cannot do the same movement pattern. Yeah, you can't do the same movement pattern every single week for a max. But if you slightly alter it, and 1 week is bench, the next week is close grip, the next week is incline, the next week is pen presses, you actually can max out every single week just by that slight alteration in exercise selection. And the same thing happens in a bodybuilding program because you're not pushing to a 1 rep max, but you are pushing to failure. You can't stay with those movements that long before they need to be rotated out for something else. And so because there's similar things that happen, say in a 1 rep max versus a 5 rep max or an 8 rep max, in that it's very demanding and you basically burn that movement out. So there has to, whether it's 6 weeks or every other week or however you're going to do it, there has to be some mechanism in there to rotate the exercises out, because if you do the same exercises to failure or for 1 rep maxes or whatever every week, you're going to wind up actually going backwards.
Yeah.
So this becomes even more true. Again, the more advanced that you are, the more this is going to be true. And so for like a brand new guy that's doing this program, if after 6 weeks, he still feels like he's progressing on the 6 week block that he's in, I'd actually tell him, yeah, you could actually keep going with that 6 week block and then just extend it out to 8 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever until you start to see diminishing returns and then switch. So you don't necessarily have to switch every 6 weeks. I encourage people to push hard enough and load aggressively enough so that in 6 weeks, you're ready to switch movements.
Yeah. Where you've probably reset once during that time, maybe. Right. And it's really hard. You start at the top of the rep range, move down, maybe have to reset once.
That would be ideal. Like if like in the program, it might say, okay, first set on quad day is a safety squat bar for a 4 to 8 rep, of one all out set of 4 to 8. Like I don't always say, but it is implied that all of those sets are basically max effort. Not necessarily like on squats. I'm not necessarily saying you have to fail, like you have to wind up like on the floor, like failure, but basically you're going to push those sets as hard as you can so that at the beginning of the 6 weeks, let's say you start off at 8 reps at 315, by the end of the 6 weeks, you want to be down. You've wanted to load aggressively enough so that you're, say, barely getting 4. Yeah. So and then you can either reset the weight or switch to a different exercise. And that's the thing with hypertrophy, is that there's a much, much wider range of movements that are available to you. Like as long as you're pushing maximally, whether you're doing a safety squat bar or a camber bar or a hack squat or a leg press, like exercise selection is, as long as they're all kind of check all the boxes, there's nothing that you have to do, and lots of movements can be equally effective. And that's one of the big differences between bodybuilding and powerlifting, is in powerlifting, you have to squat, bench, and deadlift. You don't necessarily have to do it every workout, but you have to squat, bench, and deadlift regularly. Whereas in bodybuilding, there's no movements that you have to do. And so switching from a hack squat to a leg press is fine.
Yeah,
like you don't
give yourself permission to do that.
Right.
And I'll say I ran this program before on a fat loss phase, and if you do the 7 week cycle, which is as programmed 6 weeks and then 1 week deload, you can fit 2 of those into a typical fat loss phase. And what you'll find is for the first 3-4 weeks, there might not be any drop off, right? And then it starts to catch up to you with the energy just as you're pushing the load. Then you get to that deload, and the second block is maybe a little more intense, but you're starting from what feels hard to you again, which might be a lower load than you had when you were, out of the cut. And that's okay, because again, you're still going to try to progress it upward. Yeah. I will say you might stall out on the load a tiny bit and maybe want to use reps as the variable here and there. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, what it's going to look like in practice, if you take a guy, again, let's just use a squat, for example, but let's say on the quad day, the first movement is a safety squat bar, one top set for 4 to 8 reps, and then a back off set for 8 to 12 reps. If you're in a surplus, let's say your first workout, you do 315 for a set of 8, and then the next week you go to 320, and the next week you go to 325, and the next week you go to 330. You might actually stay at 8 reps for weeks because you're in a surplus. So you're adding weight to the bar, but you're not losing reps. Whereas in a deficit, as you add load to the bar, you're going to probably fall down that rep range a little faster. So maybe, and this would be an overly simplified version, but maybe 315 for 8, and then at 320 at 7, and 325 at 6, and 330 at 5. Like you're going to, as you add load to the bar, like your performance is going to drop off a little bit more. But again, and then once you hit the bottom, if you hit, on your 5th week, let's say these are 6 week cycles of loading. So let's say on the 5th week, you get to 340 and you only get a triple. Like you fall below that, you drop out of that range that I want you in. Well, you just reset. You just go back to 315. And if you got 8, the first time through, maybe this time you try 9, or you go to 320. And if you only got it for 7 the first time, this time you try to get 8, or you try to match it, maybe because you're deeper in the diet, maybe a performance increase. Yeah. Even on reps couldn't happen, but let's just say I'm 5 pounds lighter, but I tried, I did 320 for 7 the first time and I got 320 for 7 again, but I'm 5 pounds lighter. That's good. Like that's an indication.
People forget that you're losing mass. So technically you're lifting more percentage of your body.
Yeah. So and it's an indicator. Like it's very hard to know when you're cutting or bulking for that matter, it's very hard to know because muscle mass is gained and lost slowly. It's hard to measure. Am I losing muscle mass? But your performance is the best reflection of, it's really your best measuring tool. So if at the beginning of the cut, you did 315 for 8, and at the end of the cut, you do 315 for 7, like, yeah, you lost a rep, but that's pretty good. Like, you probably, like, the fact you probably didn't lose any muscle mass, or you minimized it. Now, if at the beginning of the cut, you were at 315 for 8, and at the end, you're at 315 for 3, you probably dieted a little too aggressively, or something, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's a pretty big drop off. And so you may have lost some muscle mass. Like, so it's like how much, but it's certainly, if you can hold your numbers, like if you're 315 for 8 at the beginning and 315 at the 8 at the end, but you're 5 or 10 pounds lighter, like you won.
Like, for sure.
Yeah. Like that is like, that's hard to do, but that's a good indicator. Like, that was a really successful cut. Like there's no way that if your performance stays the same like that, but you're down in weight, there's no way you lost muscle mass.
Exactly.
So that's the best indicator of muscle is performance. And, that can be a sign to perhaps maybe when to end a cut is, when your performance starts to drop, and if you've been going for a while on this cut and you're, maybe it's time to level off and get the numbers back up a little bit, so.
Yeah. And I think you'll have some indicators before that point with some of your other biofeedback. So that's cool. If you weren't training like that, I think, a lot of the studies show you can lose 25 to 50% of that tissue is muscle. So just compare to people who are not training and dieting versus you are training, how important that is.
And that's why I don't like it. That's why, like, for a diet, I don't like a higher volume RPE based program, even though that's what Ripito makes fun of it. And it's like, if you want to just, go on and do light weights on a diet, you're going to lose muscle. And that's really true, because if you just say, well, I'm going to just operate at an RPE 7 and I'm just going to do whatever weight gives me an RPE 7, like, as you diet, that's actually, like, your weight's going to fall. Like, you're going to wind up. So you have to try to push the envelope a little bit with your effort level and your strength on the diet in order to preserve the muscle mass. But again, it's hard to do because you have limited resources. So you really have to use lower volume approaches to do that, and staying in those medium rep ranges for, if nothing else, a safety reason.
This has been awesome, man. Is there any one thing related to any of the bodybuilding stuff that we didn't cover? You're like, man, we should mention this thing.
Oh, probably
probably
hours,
right?
Probably hours of stuff. That's why it's a fascinating topic, is because there's almost an infinite amount of things to learn. I'm still learning, and by no means do I, think I have it all covered, but I think there's a lot of material that we could potentially go over, but I think we covered quite a bit today.
Yeah. I think we did, man. Yeah, because I could see doing a whole episode just on like the dog crap method and rest miles and myos and all that. All right, cool. So where can people find you, Andy?
Best way is my website is andybaker.com. And second place would be my Instagram, which is @Baker Barbell.
Your website, IG, I'll put it in there. And of course, the Baker Barbell Podcast. Since people are listening to this, they can go over there and follow, subscribe. And you definitely want to check that out.
Which now oddly enough, on my old website, I had no links to my podcast on there.
Oh, wow.
I have a newly designed website that I just had done. And so now the links to the podcast are on my new website at andybaker.com.
Yeah, no, it's looking good. All right, cool, man. Well, as always, appreciate talking to you. I could go on forever, but this is a blast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. We'll do it again.